Good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. I am Maria Calderon, Program Associate for the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center, located in Washington, D.C. As many of you already know, the Wilson Center was created in 1968 as a memorial to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and is one of the most prominent nonpartisan think tanks in the United States. It is dedicated to developing public policy proposals through independent research and constructive dialogue. The Mexico Institute is one of the 14 programs that comprise the Wilson Center and focuses on strengthening the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. On February of this year, then President Andrés Manuel López Obrador presented 18 constitutional and 2 legal reform proposals, some of which have already been approved, starting with the judicial reform. Among these proposals, the constitutional reform regarding strategic areas and state-owned companies stands out for its significant implications for the energy sector. This reform was approved by the Mexican Senate on October 17 and signed into law yesterday by current President Claudia Sheinbaum. In brief, the reform seeks to strengthen state-owned enterprises, particularly Mexican Petroleum, Pemex, and the Federal Electricity Commission, CFE, while reinforcing government participation over private investment in the energy sector. At today's event, our panelists will analyze the implications of the recently approved reform. Key topics will include expectations for secondary legislation, the current status of the energy sector, and the energy relationship with the U.S. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts from both the public and the private sectors. Joining us today, we have Duncan Wood, the current president and CEO of the Pacific Council. Duncan served as vice president for strategy and new initiatives and senior advisor to the Mexico Institute. His research and publications focus on supply chain policy, critical minerals, Mexican politics, and of course, the energy sector. He regularly has provided testimony to Congress and other national legislators and has authored 12 books. On the other hand, we have Miriam Grunstein, non-resident scholar at the U.S.-Mexico Center of the James Baker Institute at Rice University. Miriam has extensive experience practicing energy law in Mexico City, where she has represented energy companies in a variety of transactions. Her legal publications include books and articles focused on energy law, particularly in the hydrocarbon sector. Additionally, she has served as a consultant on energy regulation to Pemex, as well as to Mexico Senate and CFE. We also have Fernando Cendejas, who is a professor and energy consultant, and he previously served as the Undersecretary of Electricity at the Ministry of Energy in Mexico. He has also held positions as the head of the Legal Affairs Unit at the Ministry of Energy and General Director of Coordination. Additionally, Fernando has also served as Secretary of the Boards of Directors for Pemex, the National Center for Energy Control, the National Center for Natural Gas Control, the Energy Sector Coordinating Council, and the Mexican Petroleum Institute. And least, Pablo Zárate, who will be moderating this panel, who is a senior managing director at FTI Consulting, where he specializes in developing and overseeing management programs to address high-stake corporate challenges in the energy sector. His expertise encompasses acute political risk disputes, complex financial transactions, regulatory issues, and reputational crises. Thank you for all of you for accepting our invitation. In accordance with the principles and spirit of the Wilson Center, our goal today is to engage in a constructive discussion in which each participant can present his or her views and analysis of the reform and its implications for the U.S. and Mexico. Before we begin the discussion, I would like to remind our audience that simultaneous translation is available. In the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you should see an image of a globe. By clicking on the balloon, you will be able to choose the language of your preference. Our audience will also be able to send questions to our speakers through our X account at Mexico Institute or to our email address mexico@wilsoncenter.org. You can also post your questions in the Zoom chat. To conclude, we will have a 10-minute Q&A session moderated by Pablo. Without further ado, I will pass it on to you, Pablo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. It's great to be here with you today, and it's great to be here with Miriam, Duncan, and Fernando, good friends and extraordinary experts in the energy sector. I think I also have to commend you on your impeccable timing. I think this is the second event that you've put together that is marked by a milestone of constitutional change, and you are doing it with extraordinary timing on the exact day when the official Gazette in Mexico is publishing the change for the constitutional amendments. So congrats on both the extraordinary panelists that you've assembled together here. Thank you for letting me be a part of it, and congrats again on the timing and on the great analysis. Look, I want to start by setting the scene a little bit more broadly, because it's been only about 10 years since Mexico was making extraordinary headlines across the world and really attracting the spotlight and the attention of global investors by liberalizing or opening to investment a great chunk of its energy sector. An overwhelming majority of the value chain in the energy sector was open to investors in 2013, and now, only 11 years after that, we have political restrictions being introduced into that model. Now, this didn't happen out of the blue. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen a remarked focus from the Mexican government in the prior administration led by President López Obrador that attempted to introduce political restrictions and dismantle key elements of the reform. He didn't go after the entire 2013 Mexican energy reform, but he did insistently try to dismantle key tenets of it, whether it's very specific niches attached to it, like the clean energy certificates mechanism, and then looking at broader concepts that would have been much more disruptive, like changing the dispatch order in the power sector that would have affected both legacy investments and new investments. So I think it's important as we go forward in analyzing this discussion that we keep this in mind, right? That over the last 5 or 6 years, there has been a market push to make private investment in Mexico more limited, more restricted, and operating according to a more political vision rather than a market-led vision. So with that, let me start, just in terms of the structure of the panel so that everyone can follow along. We will start with the more certain elements of it. We'll start discussing the key tenets of what's included, what's not included, and how this needs to be viewed in the broader context of the Plan C, the 18 constitutional reforms that you talked about, Maria. And then from there, we will jump to talk about the expectations of how constitutional reform will eventually land in much more concrete elements like secondary or implementing legislation. And then from there, we can draw inferences about what the actual impact of this is going to be. To get started on that discussion with block 1 of what I just mentioned, let me turn it over to you, Fernando, and ask you, what are the key, Maria just gave us a great summary of what's included in the strategic industries reform initiative now signed into law, but perhaps you can walk us through what are the key elements and what do you see as the major kind of flashpoints of concern or elements of disruption compared to the system that we had. Over to you, Fernando.
And this is Halloween, so we're going to start talking about spooky things. And one of those things is the fact that they are trying to change the way Pemex and CFE are organized. For the past 10 years, Pemex and CFE have been treated as state productive enterprises. The main change is getting rid of the productive adjective and making them public state enterprises, which is kind of redundant. And it is very focused on CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission. There's not much detail when it comes to Pemex, the national oil company. However, there are some elements that might give us some light on what is coming. And the details will be known when they pass the secondary legislation. However, there are some things specifically in the electricity side that they have already included. For example, that there should be no profit in these activities. That's one. The other one is that no company can be prevalent over CFE. And there are several activities within the electricity sector that are open to investment that have not been included in the non-conforming measures of our free trade agreements. They're not in the USMCA, not in the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course not in the free trade agreement we have with the European Union. And those two activities are generation and commercialization or retail of electricity. So those two activities that were not reserved to the state prior to this reform are considered to be fair game for private and foreign investment. Therefore, saying that no company can be prevalent over CFE might present some issues regarding antitrust practices. And so those are one of the things that they have included. And also, they have been speaking nonstop about this proportion that CFE will keep at least 54% of the electricity generation capacity or production, and that the private sector will be allowed up to 46% of that of the total. However, that is not in the wording. It was in their proposal for 2022. However, that was rejected, and in this new reform that was just published today, it's not included. So we still have to see how they are going to try to enact that. It's also important to remember that today marks the 10th anniversary of the regulation, the reglamentos of the previous secondary legislation, or the one that's still in force. They were published on October 31st, 2014. So it's only been 10 years. However, as Pablo mentioned, as soon as López Obrador took office in December 2018, he halted all of the efforts. So this energy reform was only in place for 4 years. So the legislation didn't change, but they didn't keep on doing anything of the parts that were included in this legislation. So no bidding rounds for oil and gas contracts, no more clean energy auctions, no contracts in transmission and distribution. And the Constitution before today's publication used to say that transmission and distribution could be made was reserved to the state, but could be made by private entities through contracts with the government. That has been deleted as well. So there are a lot of things that we still don't know, that we will find out when the secondary legislation is passed. However, so far, what we know is that these changes can certainly be conflicting our position in terms of free trade agreements with our partners. And this, of course, adds another level of uncertainty for companies that want to come into Mexico to invest. And they are facing now shortages, blackouts. There's nearshoring coming in. Well, when these companies go to places to try to establish a foothold, they go to the management of CFE in the region. They are told, oh, well, there's not enough electricity for what you want to do. So you might be a big Chinese company or Asian or European or Canadian or from the US trying to establish a foothold in Mexico, but there's not enough electricity. Oh, can I generate it on my own? Well, the law says you can in Article 17 of the Electric Industry Law. However, the Energy Regulatory Commission thinks that private investment in energy generation goes against our national values and it's considered treasonous, and therefore we're going to deny your permit. So that's what we have been left with for the past 6 years, and I'm not sure that this is going to change in the future. We will see.
Fernando, and I think that a key concern there is not just that it limits opportunities for growth of Mexico, but also that it might end up going against the grain of acquired rights, right? You mentioned overall USMCA considerations. There's also the reality that a significant amount of money, depending on how you count it, it's 20, 30, 40 billion dollars that have been deployed in the pursuit of opportunities that had a specific model in mind, right? And if that model goes away in a very disruptive way, those investors are left with a very complicated decision to make, right? Which is either they litigate against Mexico or they announce to their investors that they are about to do a significant write-down of their assets operating in Mexico. And I think that introduces a very significant challenge. Now, let me move on to you.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
One really quickly. There have been a lot of companies that have actually started arbitration procedures, and so far what has been happening is that when they announce that, the government tries to negotiate with them. So there's the Talos thing in Sama, that's EMP, and then Carlos Slim, you know that guy, came and bought part of a share there, and everything was solved. Monterra and storage of fuels was having a fight and a really nasty inspections by the government, and they also started these consultations under USMCA, and Pemex is now going to buy the facility. And well, they used to hate Iberdrola, and they didn't start arbitration procedures, but they were bought out by the government as well. So those are things that might be considered indirect expropriations, and therefore could be subject to this type of investor-state mechanisms.
Thank you for pointing that out, Fernando. I think it's a key point, and all the elements that you mentioned are kind of individual cases. As companies faced some individual particular situation, they decided to start arbitration or file a notice of intent to arbitrate. Now, for a long time, there was the expectation that if the 2021 LIA reform, the power sector reform, came through, there was going to be a little bit of a wave of arbitration, right? That folks would immediately and in large groups arbitrate against the Mexican government because they would find themselves defenseless. Of course, the Mexican courts intervened, stopped the execution of that reform through injunctions, and the situation was averted. But I think it's important I mean, as we're considering the precedents from 2021 and 2019 and all that, to also understand that this is not exactly the 2021 energy reform, no, Duncan, nor is it a kind of a blanket reversal of everything that had been in the energy reform of 2013. Can you please walk us through your analysis of how this fits what's not in the constitutional reform and what's just part of broader rhetorical remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Pablo. And Fernando, thanks for doing such a good job of setting the scene and raising many of the important issues. I think there's a temptation at times like this, for those of us who have been around long enough to, see the transition from, a completely closed sector to an almost completely open sector, to say that, well, listen, we're coming full circle. Isn't that a beautiful thing? But it's not. I mean, this is not a complete reversal or revocation or repeal of the 2013 energy reform. This is not complete nationalization. This is not completely shutting out the private sector. And I think that legislators from the ruling party and their allies have been very keen on making that message clear in their public statements or in their media statements. And that's important because, we've got the beginning of a new administration, and the last thing that we want to do, last thing that Mexico wants to do, is to completely spook investors. So, it's not a renationalization of everything. It's not the recreation of a monopoly. But what I see it as is, in some way, and I think Fernando said this very well, it is an institutionalization of the AMLO energy agenda to a large degree. The things that he achieved by buying out Iberdrola's generation assets, for example, so to get a CFE up to over that 54% mark, is something that now is sort of enshrined in law, at least the right of CFE to generate at least 54%. And other panelists may be able to correct me on this one, but right now CFE is producing more than 54% of the of national electricity supply. So that institutionalization of where we have been for the last 6 years, and the fact that, let's face it, we do have a regulatory permitting environment in Mexico which is not investor friendly and which has already generated a large number of disputes, some of which have been resolved by personal audiences with President López Obrador, others which have been addressed there but not resolved, and others which have just been ignored. It really depends how good your diplomatic access to López Obrador was, in terms of getting your issues resolved. I think that the second thing, which this is not, is that it's focused very heavily on the electricity sector. There are obviously some parts of it which are pertinent to the oil and gas sector, in particular the transformation of Pemex from being a state-owned profitable enterprise to being a public company of the state, and establishing that idea that they take control of what we might call the commanding heights of the sector, that no private company shall prevail over them. And I think that's an interesting kind of language there. It's a statist approach. It certainly speaks to the principle of energy sovereignty, which AMLO used to talk about all the time, whatever that means. And we never really worked out whether that was a real thing or not. But it greatly reduces the space for the private sector in the energy industry in Mexico, but it doesn't eliminate it. I think the next point about what is not in here is really any plan about how CFE, or the electricity sector more generally, is going to produce the electricity that Mexico needs. And that's really worrying. And maybe we'll see that in the secondary legislation. Hopefully we will. Hopefully we'll see it in the energy plan that the Sheinbaum administration has for her administration, for her mandate. But there is that one mention, once again, in the legislation that that electricity should be generated and should be rather dispatched at the cheapest possible price. And that's a really worrying thing, because in today's world where we're looking at the impact of climate change, we're looking at the demand from the private sector for not just reliable energy, but ideally clean energy. You can see how this is going to go. This is very much, again, an institutionalization of a principle which AMLO believed in very firmly, which was, hey, listen, we've got a whole bunch of combustóleo, fuel oil that nobody else is going to buy from us, so let's burn it up and generate electricity. This doesn't bode well for the future of the Sheinbaum administration's environmental plans, to be honest with you. It doesn't bode well for the modernization of Mexico's energy sector. However, you could say that there is an argument to be made that, given what we saw in 2015, 2016, with the energy auctions, the electricity auctions that we saw for renewables, where we saw that, in fact, you could generate solar power at, record low prices in Mexico, that maybe there's an opening there. Maybe that's the way back into it. But I'd love to see that come through. And quite frankly, I'm not that optimistic about that happening. And lastly, I'll say, one of the key things about the conversion of both CFE and Pemex into public companies of the state And one of the rationales for that was the elimination of their commitment to best practices. And that's a funny thing, isn't it? Don't you want your state-owned enterprises, don't you want your public companies of the state to adhere to best international practices? But in fact, that was one of the justifications for this legislation, is that they wanted them not to operate like businesses. They wanted them to operate as sort of institutions of the state serving the public interest. That to me is really important, because it was actually former Ambassador Bárcena who explained to me once that, López Obrador's vision of Pemex in particular was not as an oil company per se, but really as a social enterprise, that it fulfilled a social purpose in Mexico, and you could use it in that way, providing employment, yes, absolutely, the healthcare aspects of it, the investments that Pemex makes in local communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that most importantly, it was a tool for the government to use to supplement the estado de bienestar, let's say, to supplement existing social programs. And I think that we still see that very present in this legislation as it has been passed. But coming back to the best practices point, one of the big problems that we have seen with the 2013 energy reform was that Pemex was not reformed adequately. CFE was not reformed adequately. Corruption, sclerosis, inefficiencies were there. So to a certain degree, the language of best practices didn't really resolve any of those issues anyway. But what is the plan for those organizations, for those institutions? How do we actually get them to stop being a drain on the public purse? How do we get them to stop being an impediment to the modernization of the Mexican economy? How do we get them to speak to issues that maybe Miriam is going to mention in a second, like energy justice, making sure that people have access to energy? How do we actually do all that? Because I don't see that there is a plan underway.
Duncan, compatible with the commitments that Mexico has with both international investors and more broadly the international community, right? Absent from this whole thing. I mean, if you listen at the discourse of Mexican officials recently, there has been a lot of emphasis placed on all that private investors want are clear rules. But completely absent from the analysis is how is that going to be compatible with key tenets of investability? How is this going to be compatible with commitments such as USMCA, as Fernando was mentioning? And I think this becomes a little bit more concerning once you put the broader context into focus. And there, I want to transition to you, Miriam, and ask you about, look, we're putting obviously a lot of focus on the strategic industries reform, but as Maria mentioned at the outset, there's a packet of 17 other constitutional reforms and 2 legislative changes. And when you bring that into focus, perhaps the image is slightly different than when you look just at the reform itself, no?
Thank you so much, Pablo, and thank you to the Wilson Center for having me here. And it's great to be with such great friends and colleagues. Duncan and I have been around for a very long time. I would suggest looking at this reform holistically so we can get a clearer picture, because the judicial reform is actually very relevant to this reform and to any others. Why? Because in order to attract investment or have solid commitments, you need rule of law. So the fact that the judicial reform is in place and in crises, as you mentioned, the Wilson Center has been incredibly strategic in having these panels, because just yesterday it was announced that 8 justices resigned. And coincidentally, these are the justices that actually voted for investment when the reform was challenged. when the electricity law and the hydrocarbon laws were challenged, these were the justices that issued rulings that favored investments. So and I think in the middle of 2025, they'll be leaving their positions, and I don't know what their stance will be until then. But they submitted their resignations yesterday. So that puts Mexico in an interesting hiatus in terms of law enforcement and rule of law until the elections take place to actually vote and put new justices in place. So we're in a very uncomfortable situation there. Now, this is what has already happened. Now, what in addition to that, we have the regulatory agencies reform that is pending, that we don't know the timing, the scope, and the depth of it. And that is very concerning because, as you know, we have many pending permits in the air. And how will those permits in electricity prevail if the 56 and 44% of generation is actually enacted in secondary legislation? What will happen to those permits? Will they be excluded? Will they be absorbed by the allowed 44%? How is it calculated to begin with? Mm-hmm. And also, it is a cause for great concern because what Duncan said is really right and is really poignant in terms of what is going on, is that there is an institutionalization of what is already going on. If the energy sector is going to be modeled as that has been happening for the past 6 years, and I don't think, while I'm saying this, it doesn't mean that I want this to be the status. It's just the way it is. We don't need regulatory agencies if this is going to be the permanent status. CRE and CNH are actually obsolete as it is, if this is going to be the model, because they favor Pemex and CFE in terms of permitting and in terms of revising the regulatory status, which is actually what the regulators do. They're not only permit issuers, in the past, they'd actually perform deep regulatory analysis of whether they were efficient or not. And now that efficiency and value creation are in the back burner, you don't need regulatory agencies anymore if this is going to be the permanent status. Now, that is very short-sighted. And you have to see and especially in the energy sector, you have to have a long-term vision, not the past 6 years, not the following 6 years, because you don't know what's going to happen politically when Sheinbaum leaves. And we can't really predict what's going to happen in the energy sector during this administration, because we don't know whether Sheinbaum is really bound within the realm of her action within the new constitutional framework to AMLO's wishes. Yeah. Yes, you wanted to say something. Go ahead, jump in, Pablo.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Miriam, that even though there's a lot of unknowns about how implementing legislation is going to play out, there is a market focus. Well, there is a long list of statements from government officials kind of explaining what they want to attempt. And I think the comment that Fernando made at the outset about, it seems that even though it's not in the Constitution, the idea that the Mexican state will dominate in at least 54% of the generation market is even a much more kind of fixed objective than the Constitution itself. So as we start moving towards the next block, can you walk us through what is your expectation of what is going to happen in the coming 180 days that they have to make sure that this all lands in implementing legislation?
Well, I'm worried to make political predictions. Number one, because I'm terrible at it. I am an attorney, so I work with facts, not with a crystal ball. But looking back, when the AMLO administration began, he said he would be very respectful of prior commitments, of prior contractual commitments. And then political noise began to be, there was strong political interference. And that depends a lot on who are the players within the sector. So looking back, I would say that the real energy leader was Manuel Bartlett. And if you interpret Bartlett's behavior, it's consistent with the past, that it was very litigation oriented, very disrespectful of regulatory autonomy and independence, and very aggressive towards the private sector. Now, I want to make a point
Do
regarding.
you expect that to change? I just want to use that opportunity to ask you. You think it's going to be a more kind of respectful and regulation abiding?
Well, it really depends, and I want to put my 2 cents in terms of what I've been discussing with Claudia's team. And I've been speaking on personal terms, not on institutional terms. I want to clarify that. So a lot of what I may say is hearsay. There is a tension between Tabasco and Mexico City. And one of the biggest victories Claudia has had so far is actually placing Victor Rodriguez Padilla inside of Pemex. Because Octavio Romero Oropesa liked the job, he wanted to stay, and she put her colleague from UNAM inside Petróleos Mexicanos when she negotiated with Ramírez de la O. So far Ramírez de la O is winning the energy sector. But as a result of the judicial reform, and that's why I like to look at things holistically, there were tensions between Ramírez de la O and Claudia, because Claudia has been very supportive of the judicial reform. So we have, as much as I dislike it because it's very volatile, aside from the legal and economic factors, we have to look at the political interactions between the actors of the reforms, not of the energy reform, but of the judicial reform, and how the international sphere and the domestic sphere is reacting to the judicial reform, to the energy reform that has been already enacted, and to the forthcoming regulatory reform, because that last piece might cause a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty in the private sector. And that, and actually in our bilateral commitments. And I might add that you are having elections November 6th. So that's another piece of uncertainty.
And we have to draw that into the discussion at some point.
Yes.
The US dynamic is going to be very relevant here.
Exactly.
Let me use some kind of conceptual buckets that you use to bring in Duncan into this one. It sounds like the prediction of what's going to happen in the implementing legislation, Duncan, depends really on an analysis of whether the more pragmatic voices, perhaps the hacendarios like Ramírez de la O, the Minister of Finance of Mexico, is gaining the upper hand, or whether it's the more radical voices that have been dominating the airwaves in Morena ever since 2021, right? So if you believe that the implementing legislation is going to be kind of toned down and more pragmatic, you believe that the first kind of voices will gain significant advantage. And if not, you believe that there's actually going to be continuity in what the López Obrador administration was proposing and tried to implement, and that what we will see in 2025 in the form of implementing legislation is going to be actually very disruptive. So where do you fall on this on this analysis? Are you more seeing scenario 1 or scenario 2?
Depends which day of the week you're asking me this question, Pablo, because let's face it, we get contradictory messages all the time.
Scenario 1 day or scenario 2 day?
I mean, listen, let's put this in context. I mean, we've been having this conversation about a Sheinbaum administration since before she won the administration, which is essentially, will she be able to govern the country in the way that she thinks is appropriate, or does she have to, at least for a period of time, basically follow on with the principles of AMLO's fourth transformation of Mexico.
Mhm.
There was an interesting wrinkle in that debate when, of course, she said, listen, I'm my own person, I'm going to make my own decisions, but that doesn't mean that I don't agree with AMLO. And so, you know, she may just be her own person and do the same things. What I'm seeing from her, though, so far, is that she's playing or she's walking a very fine line on this one. I think that we are seeing various messages from folks on her team, you know, particularly in, Relaciones Exteriores, in Economía, sort of saying, we want to be able to work with the private sector. We want to be more open than the previous administration was. Speaking to my friends who are much better plugged in these days than I am in Mexico's energy sector, they say they've seen a new attitude, a new approach, which is very much, yes, we understand how much we need your investment. And then we get this legislation going through. And in some ways that had to happen, because if you turned back against it at this point, having seen the Chamber of Deputies approve it in September, then it would be really a strong message, which would be against the former president, against the hardliners in Morena, and she needs to maintain that support. The secondary legislation does offer that possibility, though, of nuance, of taking a slightly more balanced and moderated approach to it. Unlike the judicial reform, for example, where so much of the detail was already in the constitutional reform. This is quite a vague constitutional reform. And so you do have ample scope here. And so, the first thing is we'll probably have to have another event, after we see the implementing legislation, which is a great chance to be reunited. I want to be hopeful, Pablo, is the simple answer. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, and the messages that I've been getting in my inbox this morning.
To be pessimistic, and I
No, but it's
I
like
appreciate that.
The messages I've been getting in my inbox this morning, more generally on economic policy about Mexico, are that yes, we want to work, we want to collaborate, and so I hope that there is a space opened up in the secondary legislation.
Can I jump in for a second, Pablo? I don't know which private sector they're referring to. I don't know if they're referring to the private sector in a market-oriented international focus, or they're giving the chance to the Mexican entrepreneurial sector. And that is very concerning. I've seen the strong industrial groups be very positive and optimistic and showing great support to Sheinbaum. And what concerns me is that we're going to have more crony capitalism than before. So this signal of saying that we're open to private investment does not necessarily mean that we're open to international, competitive, private investment.
So
I don't know
you're
if the
saying...
signal. I don't know if the signal is actually for Mexican entrepreneurs, because Mexican entrepreneurs are very happy, and I'm very concerned about that.
So what you're saying, Miriam, if I understand it correctly, is the positive signals from private investors could be despite the contents of the constitutional reform, not because of them, right? Not because they feel that more opportunities are going to be created. It's just kind of a political message of showing that they are close together with a government and that they're willing to play ball if opportunities are created, right?
Exactly.
Let me bring in Fernando to this one. Fernando, what's your expectation if in 180 days we have the privilege to be together again and we're discussing the secondary legislation, implementing legislation, how it went about? What will we be discussing? Is it something very similar to the 2021 reform that's profoundly disruptive, or is it a toned down version that is compatible with legacy investments and some market considerations?
Well, we have to see first the rules of dispatch that they are going to try to put in. Because right now, under the efficient dispatch principle, the generation plant that has the lowest cost should go first. And therefore, as you were saying about previous investments, those companies have a business plan and they know that they have a cash flow depending on how much energy they are dispatching, selling, and getting paid for. And if for some reason they try to interpret that this no company can be prevalent over CFE means that everybody has to go back in line, even though they might be cheaper or more efficient than CFE, then their cash flow could significantly decrease. For example, your generation power plant might be producing 15 hours a day, and so you have a certain cash flow. But let's say that CFE goes first, even though it might be 5 times more expensive than you. And that means that your hours will be cut in half or by a third. What would that mean? You could argue an indirect expropriation because they are not allowing you to keep on using what you had invested for under the rules that were set when you came into Mexico. So that's one thing. The dispatch, we also have to see if CFE is going to reabsorb the independent system operators, CENACE, the National Energy Control Center. That's because it isn't only in charge of dispatch, but it also is the one that operates the wholesale electricity market. Will we still have a wholesale electricity market in 6 months? And another thing, they are in charge of the interconnection and connection to the grid. Right now, what we have in the legislation is the principle of non-discriminatory access and free access. Will we still see that, or CFE be the one that has all the privileges and every other participant will either have to plead and beg or have a friend in the administration to get through? That goes for the generation side, but also for retailers and traders. What are they going to do? Right now, we have 57 qualified suppliers in the market, and those can offer electricity at competitive prices, and there's this contractual freedom to sign whatever each party thinks is in their best interest. Will that be possible still in 6 months? And what will happen with all the companies that have already entered into those contracts? Will those be terminated or would those be respected? And in the other side, transmission and distribution. Right now, all the blackouts and the congestions have been mainly because CFE has not been investing enough in transmission and distribution. Will that still be a problem? And with the erasing in the Constitution, by erasing in the Constitution the possibility of having contracts with private entities, will that mean that the government is to do everything on its own in transmission and distribution? And will that be feasible considering our goals regarding climate change and clean energy generation? And for the oil and gas sector, what will that mean, for example, for fuel stations? Right now, what we are seeing is that many companies are going back to Pemex because Pemex is engaging in these questionable discounts. Oh, come back to Pemex, to the Pemex brand, and you're going to have gasoline at 1 peso lower per liter than your competitors. Is that good for Pemex's finances just because we want to see their logo in a fuel station, not because it is competitive or efficient? And let's also talk about the E&P sector. What is happening right now? Many of the contracts that were awarded during the bidding rounds have gone what's natural. They didn't have geological success, no discoveries. So they are returning those areas to the state. In every other country, what happens is that the government, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, the US has the BOEM, and the Department of the Interior, what does it do? It makes these auctions, and the companies come and bid, and they start their plans, and they eventually produce. Or if they don't find anything, they give that area back. What's happening right now is that we are in that process, but there has there hasn't been any new contracts awarded since 2018. So what we are seeing is that this has been stalling, and the
Manuel,
new.
let me ask you a little bit more broadly. It sounds like you're saying we're seeing a recurrent pattern where the state-owned enterprises, which were supposed to be productive up until today, have been engaging more in trying to win back market share at any possible cost, potentially considering some actions that some folks would see as anti-competitive, right? But we are in the midst of a constitutional reform that introduces that notion of prevalence at the heart of it. So do you think that the state-owned enterprises will now rest a little bit in terms of these practices and say, I now have this in the Constitution, I can focus on being a little bit more constructive or on being a little bit more profitable? Or
I wouldn't bet on it. I mean, because what we have seen so far is that they want everything. They are not
you
they're
see
covering
a
all the
continuous
bases, and they
push
don't want
despite this.
anybody to be able to overshadow them. And the CEO of Pemex has just said that, or there will be, with clear rules, some alliances. Well, I mean, what they are telling us is that they are going to go back to service contracts, and all the mayors are already scared, and I don't see them coming back or trying to go into, I mean, maybe Chevron, they are friends of the Venezuelans, but everybody else might be not very open to that because the rules are not clear, and the government changes its mind, and they now have a supermajority in both houses of Congress to reverse track and unfulfill every requirement or every agreement they make.
Yeah, so the in your view, the tug of war continues, and that is tremendously concerning, Miriam and Duncan, because we do have to consider the context, right? There's a deficit in energy infrastructure in Mexico. There's a deficit in what we're producing compared to what we could be producing. There's a deficit in terms of the goals that we have for clean energy generation, right? And we're not hitting those targets as there is this tug of war, particularly driven by the government that wants to flip market share back to its own hands. Can you talk a little bit about this broader context of the energy infrastructure deficit that we're facing? Miriam, maybe starting with you.
You're on mute,
You're
Miriam.
on mute. Miriam, you're on mute.
Duncan, go ahead. You want to go ahead? Because I just
Sure. Yeah, listen, it's no secret that the underinvestment in both generation and in transmission of electricity in Mexico has been holding the country back. It's one of the reasons why nearshoring investment hasn't surged in the way that we would hope it to have done. Of course, the government celebrates those FDI numbers, which are very, very high, but overwhelmingly that is reinvestment by existing companies. It's not new investment coming into the country. And you see how Brazil, for example, is capturing nearshoring and foreign direct investment in a way which is much more ambitious and energized than Mexico. You think about how some of the Southeast Asian nations are benefiting from the relocation from China as well. Mexico just hasn't been performing. And one of the big reasons is because there isn't a reliable supply of energy in Mexico. There isn't a ongoing investment in generation, in particular in clean energies in Mexico. And that worries a lot of investors. Ultimately, the main question that they ask is, will I have a reliable electricity supply? And if you don't have that, then I can't put my data center there, for example. And I think this takes us back to the years prior to the 2013 reform in some ways, which is that a lot of companies were interested in investing in Mexico. They wanted to come into Mexico, but the cost of energy, the price of energy was so high that it actually made much more sense to invest in one of the southern states of the United States. The overall infrastructure for energy dispatch in the United States is so much better developed than in Mexico. Now, it becomes a political issue, of course, and we've been speculating about this since the beginning of the López Obrador administration. So for the last 6 years, we've been saying, recurring apagones, blackouts, power cuts in Mexico will surely damage the legitimacy of the government. Doesn't seem to have done so far. Maybe we're on the verge of something else. But to me, the lack of investment in infrastructure is something which is a serious challenge for the Sheinbaum administration, particularly because she will not have the funds available to embark upon a big infrastructure spending spree at this point in time. She will have to work with the private sector if that's going to happen. And she's probably going to have to pay over and above the going market rate for those things, just because there is the uncertainty given all of the prevailing conditions in Mexico.
Miriam, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, I was in an event the other day, and I was speaking to Alejandra Leon about the amounts of investment required. Alejandra Leon is in S&P, and it's pretty crazy how the numbers vary from analyst to analyst. We have investment needs, total investment needs from $34 billion to $83 billion. Including generation and transmission.
In which time span?
In the coming 5 or 6 years.
Oh.
And that's a lot of money. When I heard $83 billion, I mean, I was really taken aback. I don't know how they calculated that amount, but that's astronomical. And aside from private investment,
Mexico has never been able to attract that kind of investment.
No. I mean, it's unheard of.
For reference of the audience,
it really blew my mind when I heard that number. I mean,
record years were 10, 12 billion.
Exactly. I mean, I heard about 6 billion for the next 5 years. So that amounts to the lower number, which is 34 billion. But 83, that blows my mind. And also we've been talking about private investment, but Duncan knows that one of my great concerns is energy poverty and energy justice. If Pemex, both Pemex and CFE want it all, there's going to be a huge opportunity cost for the poor. Because I mean, the private sector does not have an obligation to attend to the needs of the energy poor in Mexico, and that number has not been reduced. The latest studies still speak of 40 million homes in energy poverty. Meaning by energy poverty, I mean the sufficient, clean, and reliable energy people need to fulfill their basic needs. I'm not talking about any luxurious additional desires, just basic livelihood. So if Pemex and CFE, and I have to refer to both because the energy poor rely greatly on LPG, and that's provided for by Pemex mainly to the retailers, they won't be able to take care of the poor. If they're going to be competing with private companies, they're not going to be able to have to attend to the energy poor. And a lot of resources, federal resources, such as health, security, education, are also going to be sacrificed. Because if they're not going to be forced or pressured to produce income. And it's strange how they confuse value with profitability, because what the former energy reform said is that they never spoke about profit. They spoke about value creation. Right. And value creation is by any means in contradiction with the public good. So the interpretation of value versus profit is really crazy. Because they're confusing the word value, commercial value, with profit.
And you're saying at the end of the day, Pemex and CFE compete for resources from the Mexican budget.
It's
With
exactly, they
social
compete.
programs and other stuff. So it's not that this losses that they have been recurrently having are just socialized.
No,
It's this notion that the money has to come from somewhere, right?
exactly.
And
The money
impacting
has to come from
the
somewhere.
possibilities. Yeah,
And you know, money is a scarce resource in Mexico,
yeah.
as in everywhere else in the
Increasingly,
world.
yeah,
And and resources are direly needed for health, for public security, which is gravely compromised at this point, and for education. And on top of that, I mean, if Pemex and CFE are going to be entities that whose first and final commitment is going to be the public good, why are they competing with private companies? And strangely so, there was some during the discussion of your energy reform, there was a part of a provision that was eliminated, which said that the transition will be in charge of the state. And then then it was removed by Morena because they said that there's no way the state can take care of the transition doing it alone. And they said so explicitly. So it is a crazy.
it was Ricardo Monreal,
Ricardo Monreal,
the
exactly.
leader of the
Ricardo
Morena
Monreal that
caucus
said
in the lower
there's no
house.
way that the state can take care of their transition. So they eliminate that provision in the amendment, and then they talk about Pemex and C prevailing, and
Yeah.
and so there's a lot of contradictions, and I don't know how they're going to be reflected upon in the secondary legislation.
Yeah, I want to make sure, I mean, we're in the last stretch of the panel
Yeah,
before we move
exactly.
on to some of the questions and answers. I do see a few from the audience. If you want to add a question, just make sure to input your question in the chat box. I want to make sure that we bring in the US-Mexico perspective, or more broadly, the North American perspective into this. And there, Duncan, I want to start with you. Things have changed dramatically in the US-Mexico relationship. And how does what we have been discussing fit into this changing landscape in North America, both in terms of policy, but perhaps more importantly now, in terms of its politics?
Yeah, so I mean, let's focus on how the relationship has changed. Yeah, there's the sort of the superficial diplomatic issues that we deal with on a daily basis in the bilateral relationship, but then there's the economic fundamentals of that relationship, and that shift has been quite remarkable. If you go back to 2010, 2011, Mexico was a large net exporter of energy to the United States, largely through crude oil exports. Since then, with the decline in Mexican oil production and subsequently in oil exports, you've seen that the relationship has become reversed. The United States is now a massive net exporter of energy to Mexico, and of course makes a lot of money out of that. You think about the huge amounts of natural gas which are coming from various plays in the United States and being transported to Mexico through pipeline. And now, of course, we have the prospect potentially of those LNG exports coming from out of Mexican ports, but it is in fact US gas that's going through there. There's very, very soon we'll reach the point where the export of natural gas to Mexico will be equivalent to 1/3 of US natural gas production. That's huge. I mean, absolutely enormous. And Mexico now finds itself in a highly dependent situation on US natural gas. This reform does nothing to address that. I tend to be a kind of person who celebrates interdependence, economic interdependence between nations. I think it's a positive thing. But this should worry a lot of folks in Mexico, which is that why are we not developing our own natural gas resources here in Mexico? And the only way to do that is, of course, by working with the private sector. The only way to do that is to actually bring in that expertise, because Pemex has consistently made the decision not to develop natural gas. They'd much rather just flare it or vent it, which of course is an environmental and climatic disaster. So that element of the relationship, I think, is not addressed by this by this reform. Secondly, we've already talked about the potential for really quite damaging investor disputes. During the López Obrador administration, we saw a lot of those anyway. None of them were really addressed by meaningfully by either the López Obrador or the Biden administration over the last 4 years. It's constantly the ball has been, or the can has been kicked down the road, and we're still waiting to see how those play out. We'll see another surge in those investor disputes at this point in time, and the timing on that couldn't be worse. We're all focused now on next Tuesday's election here in the United States, but we're also focused on the USMCA review process that will happen in 2026. We've already got a number of flies in the ointment, shall we say? The judicial reform is a serious irritant. The refusal by the López Obrador administration over the last 6 years to address any of the trade and investment disputes, particularly as it pertains to the energy sector, has been raised many times by Congress. And I think we see the potential right now for a breakdown in that relationship between Mexico and the United States because of the number of disputes that are out there. And this is only going to get worse, I think, as we get closer to that USMCA review process. And Fernando has already mentioned the USMCA and the CTPTT. It's not just the United States here. There will be a number of other countries that will challenge Mexico.
And Duncan, it sounds like those considerations about potentially countries challenging Mexico in commercial terms would come at the time when the implementing legislation is unveiled, right? That folks are taking a wait and see approach and saying, well, this constitutional reform potentially, right, undermines the commitments that we have had bilaterally. Let's just wait and see how Mexico figures out whether they will remain compatible or not. No, so it does sound like that milestone on the horizon is going to be incredibly important to delineate Mexico's trade relationships, not just with
That's
the
right. And while we've been on this call, Pablo, I mean, I got a WhatsApp message from a colleague in Mexico, representing US firms down there and a US firm down there, and basically saying, we do see a new attitude. We see a more positive attitude from the Sheinbaum administration. They are reaching out. That's going to be fundamentally important in addressing these concerns, because it's not just state-to-state diplomacy which is going to count here. You're going to have to see a lot of diplomacy between the Mexican government and the private sector, both foreign and national.
A lot of engagement. I absolutely agree with that. Duncan. Fernando, what's your view on US-Mexico relations as this moves forward? It sounded from your comments at the outset that you're very much focused on USMCA considerations, which Duncan has covered a little bit. But is there anything that you would like to add or differentiate in your point of view here?
Well, I don't think that we will be seeing many changes in the dynamic that they had acquired during the AMLO presidency. I think that they will stay at a lower level than they have been in the past. And we have seen that, for example, the Department of Energy has tried to reach the Mexican, their counterparts, and they weren't very successful on doing that, engaging in projects during the Nale administration. We don't know how Luz Helena is going to act in that regard, but what we have seen in the past with the Morena administration is that every time they are questioned, they
I think we're losing you, Fernando, for a little bit. We're a little bit constrained for time now, so I wanna flip it over to you, Miriam, on the U.S.-Mexico relation before we open it to the floor and spend a good 15 minutes there.
Well, I'm going to be very brief, and we have to look at what happens November 6th in the United States. And we have to see what happens, who wins, Trump or Kamala. And that I think that's going to be a strong breaking point in terms of what is expected from Mexico. So, I mean, I can't really tell because of the election we might have great surprises because we have a head-to-head tie at this point. So it's going to be very interesting.
So the style of leadership is going to
The,
make
the type
a
of
significant
leadership of
difference in
whether,
what
I
you
mean,
expect.
if Donald Trump wins, I think the expectations of Mexico going through abiding by transition commitments will be strongly affected. But there might be no pressure to commit to our transition targets if Trump wins, and who knows what will happen with the
Yeah, the
US.
focus and the emphasis and the style
Exactly,
of
and the
rhetoric
emphasis on transition.
are
So
markedly different. From,
exactly, and markedly different. If Kamala wins, well, she didn't like the USMCA anyway. So it will be an interesting breaking point for Mexico too. But we expect the climate the Inflation Reduction Act and the climate reduction bill to prevail. And so we would have another scenario. So we'll see, because it really takes two to tango.
Thank you, Miriam. Fernando, anything that you want to add? You broke up a little bit there. We're at the final stretch, so we only have a minute or so. But anything that you want to add before we open it up to Q&A?
Well, I hope that you still hear me.
Yes.
But
you do.
what I think is that there's different things that should be taken into account. The fact that the US is going through a very turbulent political process, and that they haven't been able to look at what's happening in their southern neighbor. So we have to see what they are going to do in the secondary legislation and see if they are going to be like they did, and Duncan mentioned this. The ambassador would come to the National Palace in Mexico City and try to solve problems on a company by company basis. I don't think that's sustainable, and that's not something that's done in a civilized country. So let's see how that goes.
All right. So starting with Q&A, I'm going to abuse my power as moderator here. And given that I'm sitting in Texas, I'm going to draw from the question that is Texas-centered. Ferdows Intash, Fred, says, I attended an energy conference of Texas in 2020. Does Mexico have any stable energy relationship with Texas? I'm sure, Miriam, you have a strong point of view on this, given that you've spent a little bit of time here as well. And Duncan and Fernando, obviously, feel free to jump in at any point.
Go for it, Duncan. I just spoke.
I mean, listen, the relationship between Mexico and Texas is a conflicted one in general, right? Governor Abbott has been one of the more vociferous voices sort of speaking against migration, in particular, the violence in Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen outreach from Governor Samuel Garcia in Nuevo León trying to build a better relationship with him. But on the energy relationship, I mean, it's a very positive energy relationship in that way. You're seeing, you know, exports of natural gas, which are very, very important to the prosperity of the Texan economy. You're seeing major infrastructure projects, including the gas pipelines. We still need to see a lot more investment, I would argue, in terms of cross-border electricity trade between Texas and Mexico, in particular in the aftermath of the breakdown of Texas's electricity system during extreme weather last year. I mean, this is something where, you know, bringing the two countries closer together, bringing Texas and northern Mexico closer together, so that the electricity grid really does reflect the economic region of Texas and northern Mexico. I think that would be a very positive thing. So overall, I think the energy relationship is a positive one between Texas and Mexico.
Okay. Let me move on to the next question. And if at any point, Miriam, Fernando, you want to jump in to address any of the questions, let's jump in. But I want to make sure that we cover as much.
I have
as
answered
possible.
most of them in the chat, one by one. I have to leave in a very short time because it's already 10:17 and we were supposed to finish by 10:15.
Thank you, Fernando.
Well, I'd like to say something very briefly, that whoever wins in the United States, it's not like in Mexico. You don't have, in the States, you don't have two state control NOCs. So whatever Trump or Kamala decide, will have to be in terms of antitrust laws. They cannot impede or promote any certain participation of US based or US companies. We tend to think that's the case. It's like, well, Trump is going to ban exports of natural gas to Mexico. He cannot do that because it's a decision of the companies to export or not natural gas or gasoline to Mexico.
That's a good point. Let me continue with John's question. I think we have a few more minutes until 11:30, and sorry if there has been a little bit of a misunderstanding in terms of the agenda and what when it ends. But let me continue with John's question. Why can't Pemex pursue non-service contracts from a legal perspective under this new legal framework being rolled out? Won't this just be back to the future, going back to contractual models used in the 1980s? Aren't the comments being made premised on open market regulations? Duncan, do you want to take a stab at that?
I do not want to take a stab at that. John Padilla is always trying to trip me up with these very technical questions, and I would just make a fool of myself. So I'll turn it over to Miriam.
I'm sorry, Pablo, my dogs were barking. I didn't get to hear the question. I'm sorry, I'm very embarrassed, but my dogs are all out and
let's just use Alberto Perezcano then, who does have a direct question for Duncan, hopefully not to trip you up, Duncan, but it's, what do you believe are the viable options for stakeholders that trusted Mexico with billions of gross fixed investment now after cascade of reforms challenging trust?
So, I mean, the first thing I say is that the traditional mechanisms of dispute resolution are there, but they haven't proven to be particularly agile. They take a long time. They depend upon a lot upon political will still. And yeah, as we've seen over the past 4 years with the Biden administration, there hasn't been the willingness on the part of the White House to really push those forward. And without that support from the US government, it becomes very, very difficult. It takes a long time. You might ultimately end up winning, but in the meantime, you've lost a lot of money and you've missed out on those investment opportunities. So the second option is what we've already mentioned on a couple of occasions, which is getting close to the government. And we've seen that was actually quite effective for some American firms in particular during the López Obrador administration, the meeting at the National Palace. But I would say a word of caution there. Even if President Sheinbaum continues what AMLO did, we have a bit of a problem, which is that, I've heard about cases where AMLO met with the investors, agreed that they had a case to be made, said, okay, we'll resolve your issue. But then it still took years after that for the issue to be resolved. And that's partly because of the bandwidth of the Mexican government has been so, the public service has been so hollowed out, the regulatory agencies have been so hollowed out, that there just isn't the bandwidth right now within the Mexican government to address these concerns. I think the third thing is to say and this is kind of brutal, but it's what we've seen a number of US firms in particular doing over the past 6 years, which is they've sold up. They've sold their assets and they've moved on. They've said, okay, we took a bath in Mexico and that's fine. Lesson learned. And this ultimately, I think, is really sad for those of us who were so enthusiastic about the prospects of moving Mexico's energy sector forward post 2013. That all of that has come crashing down. And what's left is an investment space, perhaps for the less reliable international partners, maybe for the Russian and Chinese firms that would like to come in. And that's going to raise eyebrows here in Washington as well.
I would like to take Duncan's last point, and it's discriminatory treatment or unequal treatment of companies. I was engaging with a few European companies when AMLO was meeting with American companies and reaching agreements, and they didn't like it at all because fair and non-discriminatory treatment is a basic policy in any free trade agreement, not only the USMCA, which I think is very valuable, but we also have around 138 free trade agreements in Mexico that we have to honor. And non-discrimination is fundamental.
Well, I think we can leave it there. Thank you so much, Duncan, Fernando, Miriam. I very much enjoyed this conversation with you. Thank you, Maria, for organizing this event, and obviously to the broader Wilson Center team. And thanks to everyone that joined this discussion and proposed ideas and questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great job,
Thank
Pablo.
you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.